There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
I do not see Mr. Darwin in the hall today. I understand he is not in the best of health. But I do see some of his friends looking remarkably like the rest of us. We are all members of that species which my scientific...
That man speaking is...
Samuel Wilberforce, Bishop of Oxford, one of this city's great orators.
This is the scene of the Great Oxford Debate, which took place on June 30th, 1860. It had been 8 months since Charles Darwin had published on the origin of species. It wasn't meant to be a debate, but more a discussion of Darwin's theory. The meeting was presided over by Darwin's former Cambridge mentor, John Henslow. Also present was Darwin's old shipmate and captain of the HMS Beagle, Robert Fitzroy. Now, Fitzroy, who had walked the islands of the Galapagos with Darwin, was, surprisingly enough, there to lend support to the opposition. In defense of Darwin was his closest friend Joseph Hooker and the biologist Thomas Henry Huxley. Darwin himself was not present, having sent word before that he wasn't feeling well.
What Mr. Darwin would have us believe is that every beast, every creeping thing, every fish and plant, flies, fungus, elephant, turnip, is descended from one primordial form into which life was first breathed.
The debate had found its footing not only in the hallowed halls of academia, but also on the streets, and not only in London, but the world. With one book, Charles Darwin had caught the attention of pretty much everyone. His theory was simple. It was simple, powerful, and elegant. And it made perfect sense. It didn't take long to recognize its poetic beauty once you realized that there was no purpose behind it all. Natural selection was blind, but with that blindness was power, and the ability to shape the clay of life into an endless variety of forms. But Wilberforce was having none of it.
I see I have made little impression on Mr. Huxley. Let me ask him just one question. Is it through his grandfather or his grandmother that he claims descent from a monkey?
Thomas Huxley hadn't intended to be there originally. He had actually planned to leave Oxford the day before, but he had bumped into the author Robert Chambers, and it was Chambers who had urged Huxley to stay for the meeting. Chambers was the anonymous writer of the controversial book Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. You can learn more about Chambers and his book at evolutiontalk.com/Chambers. Word on the street was that Wilberforce was being coached and prepped for the meeting by none other than the biologist Richard Owen. Owen had already set himself up against Darwin, perhaps out of professional jealousy. He was also not very well liked, for he set himself up against pretty much everyone. After Wilberforce had finished, there are claims that Huxley turned to those around him and said,
"The Lord hath delivered him into my hand."
He then went on to answer Wilberforce's question.
I will answer your question, my Lord Bishop. An ape may seem to you to be a poor sort of creature, of low intelligence and stooping gait, that grins and chatters as we pass. But I would rather have an ape for an ancestor than a man who is prepared to prostitute his undoubted gift of eloquence and culture to the service of prejudice and falsehood.
I finished your book yesterday. No work on natural history science has made so great an impression on me, and I do heartily thank you for the great store of new views you have given me. As for your doctrines, I am prepared to go to the stake if requisite.
This was a letter that Huxley had written to Charles Darwin on November 23, 1859. And go to the stake he did, many times. Well, figuratively speaking, of course.
I am sharpening up my claws and beak in readiness.
Huxley came to be known as Darwin's Bulldog for this very thing, a title he apparently came up with himself. Charles Darwin was a quiet man. He preferred the quiet comforts of his home in Down, where he could think and conduct experiments and capture his thoughts on paper. Now, he wasn't a recluse, not by any stretch of the imagination, but he rarely strayed far from his wife Emma and the children. The man who had revealed the theory of evolution by natural selection to the world was pretty much a homebody. Now, when Huxley had first picked up his copy of On the Origin of Species, he had been prepared to be unimpressed. He was already aware of Darwin's thoughts on the subject of transmutation, as evolution was often referred to, and he wasn't convinced. He himself was of the mind that life on Earth hadn't changed all that much. If it had changed at all, it certainly couldn't be traced back to a single substance. That would require a world where change was the norm and not the exception. But page by page, Huxley's eyes were opened to the beauty of Darwin's theory. He finally got it. And after he had finished the book, he chastised himself.
How stupid of me not to have thought of that.
Thomas Henry Huxley was born in 1825, one of 8 children. He was so unimpressed with the formal education that school offered that by the age of 10, he was done with it. He preferred to teach himself, and teach himself he did. Huxley was a self-educated man, and he was to become one of the most knowledgeable men in England. He was particularly keen on studying comparative anatomy. How were living things alike? And as his knowledge and interests broadened, that question extended to comparing mankind to apes. He is also said to be one of the first to recognize the connection between birds and those long-extinct creatures called dinosaurs. It's worth mentioning, too, that the word dinosaur was new to the literature and lecture halls of England. It was first used in 1842 by none other than that most disliked man, Richard Owen. If it feels like Owen may be getting a bad rap here, he isn't. Deborah Cadbury, author of The Dinosaur Hunters, published in 2000, said of Owen that he had an almost fanatical egoism with a callous delight in savaging his critics. Even Charles Darwin, usually averse to speaking out against another man, said of Owen,
Owen is a fool, and his best work, at least that work which was his, and not what he claimed was his, is behind him. His problem with my theory is that he didn't come to it first. After it was published, it was too late. It says something that the man has not a single follower or pupil to his name.
Suffice to say, Huxley was warming up to the idea of transmutation. This after discarding the book by Robert Chambers as fiction and Lamarck's theories as flights of fancy. But then everything changed after he read On the Origin of Species. In it, he was presented with an argument so beautiful, so elegant, that he couldn't turn away from it. The species around him had evolved, and all it required was time, vast amounts of time.
In fact, the whole evidence is in favor of evolution, and there is none against it. I meet constantly with the argument that the doctrine of evolution cannot be well founded, because it requires the lapse of a very vast period of time.
This was the problem that most men and women had with the theory.
But I have not the slightest means of guessing whether it took 1,000,000 years, or 10 million, or 100 million, or 1,000 million years to give rise to that series of changes. A biologist has no means of arriving at any conclusion as to the amount of time which may be needed for a certain quantity of organic change. He takes his time from the geologist, but suppose now that an astronomer, or a physicist, for instance, tells me that my geological authority is quite wrong. My reply is, that is not my affair. Settle that with the geologist, and when you have come to an agreement among yourselves, I will adopt your conclusion.
It was a revelation. Enamored with this new theory on the evolution of life by natural selection, Huxley drew his sword and leapt into battle. After crossing swords with Wilberforce in 1860, he did the same with Owen. In 1862, he actually prevented Owen from being elected to the Council of the Royal Society. Darwin's Bulldog was born. Huxley was fascinated with the idea that man and apes shared a common ancestor. In 1863, he published his own take on the subject in Evidence as to Man's Place in Nature. It was one of the very first scholarly attempts to explain the evolution of mankind. And this was almost 10 years before Charles Darwin's magnum opus, The Descent of Man. Great minds, it seems, think alike. For more than 30 years, until his death in 1895 of a heart attack, Huxley continued to defend Darwin's theory. Now, it's worth mentioning that Huxley was no blind acolyte. He didn't necessarily agree with everything Darwin had to say. He had his own ideas which he applied to the framework of natural selection. But the one problem he had with the theory had to do with the evidence of its validity. Huxley was an empiricist, and he needed to see things with his own two eyes in order to believe them wholeheartedly. Since natural selection took centuries to work its magic, Huxley was left to piece together the evidence by examining the fossil record. Now, this was all well and good, but Huxley wanted more. He wanted to see a species split off into two branches to the point where they could no longer interbreed. He was also of the opinion that evolution might make sudden jumps in development. Now, this idea is known as saltationism. I should also point out that the exchange of ideas went both ways. Darwin learned from Huxley as well. Most notably was Huxley's ideas about how man should handle himself when faced with the unknown. There are things in nature and in the universe which are knowable. Science is the method by which the unknown can become the known. As powerful a tool as science may be, there are areas of study which will eventually lead nowhere. When faced with a dead end, the best thing to do is to no longer consider it a valid path. If a claim cannot be demonstrated or tested, then it's not worthy of further consideration. Huxley called his method of approach agnosticism. He rejected any claims that were made without proof, while others leapt to conclusions based on little more than unsubstantiated faith. This put Huxley at odds with claims about a creator for which he would say he wasn't rejecting the notion of, it was simply not worth his consideration, at least not until there was some evidence presented that deserved his attention. Darwin eventually adopted Huxley's term and applied it to his own view on the subject, and left it at that. Thomas Henry Huxley went to bat for the ideas that he believed in. Armed with knowledge and conviction, he defended not only his own ideas, but the ideas of others. Huxley is not alone in this. Mankind's history celebrates others who have stood up against conventional thoughts and injustice. The only shame in that is the fact that those who do stand out when it should be the norm. I would love to hear your thoughts about today's show. What do you think about Huxley? You can let me know by using the site's contact page or on Twitter, where you can reach me at Rick Coast. To find out how you can support the show, please visit evolutiontalk.com/support. We all live busy lives, and it really means a lot to me that you take the time to listen to the show every week. Thank you for that. And until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.